Forgiveness isn't about them. And nobody is more annoyed by that than I am.
You're listening to Unbound Off Script. No outlines, no safety nets, just Beth Curry talking about whatever the hell she wants, or whatever the hell you've asked her to uncover. It's unfiltered, it's unpredictable, and it's officially started. Pull up a chair.
Hey everybody, welcome back, or welcome for the first time, I guess. Either way, pull up a chair. This is an off-script episode, which means it's just me. No chapter to read, no book to anchor to, just whatever's living in my head that feels worth talking about. And right now, what's living in my head is peace, which sounds very zen and possibly like something you'd find cross-stitched on a pillow at a craft fair, but I promise I'm going somewhere with it, okay? Just recently wrapped up season 3 here on Unbound, and at the end of the final episode, or actually it was pretty much the epilogue in the book, right? I said something I don't usually say out loud, and I talked about how I've found peace, like real peace. Not the I did 10 minutes of meditation and lit a candle kind of peace, not the I've decided to simply not think about the hard stuff kind, the actual bone deep, I can breathe when I think about my past kind of peace. And I had more than a few of you reach out to say some version of how. So that's what today is. It's me trying to answer that question honestly and with the help of a few frameworks from psychology that genuinely changed the way I understand myself and the people who've shaped me, sometimes gently and sometimes by throwing a grenade through my living room window. So let's start at the bottom. I want to begin with something that might feel a little clinical, but stick with me because this piece completely reframed the way I thought about my own reactions to my own life. Polyvagal theory. So this was developed by a researcher named Dr. Stephen Porges. And here's the short version. Your vagus nerve, which runs from your brainstem all the friggin' way down through your heart and your lungs and your gut, is basically a constant surveillance system. It's scanning your environment 24 hours a day, asking one simple question: am I safe? And based on its read of the room, your nervous system is doing one of 3 things. So it's either in a ventral vagal state, which is your green zone. You're regulated, you're social, you're open, you're present, or it's in sympathetic activation, which is your fight or flight mode. We've all heard about that, right? The chest tightness, the jaw clenching, the feeling like you might crawl out of your skin, or it drops all the friggin' way down into what's called dorsal vagal shutdown, which is the freeze. It's the numbness. It's the I don't feel anything and I'm not sure that's a good thing mode. What changed for me when I really understood this was you cannot think your way out of a physiological state, okay? You can't logic yourself calm when your nervous system is convinced you're in danger. Telling yourself to calm down when you're in full sympathetic activation is like telling your smoke alarm to relax. And don't get me started on when anyone tells you to relax. Because, well, that's unacceptable in my household. Your body's not listening to you. It has a job, right? And when I think about my history, about some of the things that were done to me, some of the dynamics I lived inside for years, I understand now that my body was responding appropriately to what it was experiencing. The hypervigilance was not weakness, and the shutting down wasn't weakness either. It was hardware, doing exactly what hardware is supposed to do, right? The path out of it isn't willpower. It's learning to signal safety back to your own body, long, slow exhales, cold water on your face, humming all of the things because the vibration activates the vagus nerve. Movement, touch, the boring physical, unglamorous work of convincing your nervous system that the threat has passed, or maybe that it wasn't even there to begin with. And until you do that, until your body believes it's safe, nothing else works. Nothing. You can't access clarity. You can't access compassion. You can't process or heal or forgive. You're just white knuckling it, which I have a lot of experience with, for the record. So that's the foundation. You have to get your body on board first. And it's not a one-time thing. It is a practice. Some days it takes 3 minutes of deep breathing and I'm fine. And other days I need to take a walk and talk out loud to myself like a person whose neighbors definitely wonder about her. That's just real life. Okay? Once your body is settled enough to actually hear yourself think, you usually notice something. There's a lot going on in there. Multiple voices, multiple opinions, multiple widely conflicting impulses, all firing at once. Boom, 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 boom. This is the part where people usually assume they're unwell. I'd like to reassure you that you're not unwell, or at least not for this reason specifically. There's a therapeutic model called internal family systems. It was developed by a therapist named Richard Schwartz, and the core premise is your mind is not a single unified voice, okay? It's more like a family, a sometimes dysfunctional, occasionally screaming, frequently well-intentioned family of parts, all of whom are just trying to keep you alive and okay. Some of these parts are what IFS calls managers. So they're the ones running the show on the surface. The perfectionists, the overachievers, the people pleasers, the parts that work really hard to keep things under control so that nobody gets hurt, right? I'm familiar with this part. She is exhausting and she means well. Then there's the firefighters. These are the crisis responders, okay? When something hits an old wound hard enough that the managers can't hold it, the firefighters show up with whatever gets you through the moment. Numbing, distraction, rage, humor, sometimes a truly unreasonable amount of online shopping. No judgment. This is just what they do. And then there are what Schwartz calls exiles, and these are the wounded parts, okay? The parts that carry old pain and old shame and old experiences that were too much to process at the time. And so they got packed like into a box and shoved into a back room that everyone agreed not to open that door to. The managers and the firefighters spend enormous amounts of energy making sure those exiles stay in their box, right? Because the assumption, the terrified, well-meaning assumption, is that if the exile gets out, it will destroy everything. And here's what I want to say about that. It won't. The goal of this model is not to evict any of your parts. Okay, it's not to silence the anxious ones or shame the ones who've done embarrassing things in the name of survival. The goal is what IFS calls self-led living, which means developing access to the calm, curious, compassionate core that exists underneath all of these parts, right? The self with a capital S. The one that can look at every scared, frantic, grieving part and say, I see you. What are you trying to protect me from? Right? When I started asking that question about my own internal noise, things began to shift. The part of me that spent years terrified of being seen, she was protecting me from the experience of being seen and then destroyed, which had happened. And the part of me that deflected with humor every time something got too real, same. That part that stayed so small, so as to not provoke, still the same wound, different costume, right? These parts weren't my problems. They were my solutions to problems I had before I had better tools. And when I stopped fighting them, when I genuinely got curious about what they were holding, that's when the internal war started to quiet down. Peace isn't the absence of complicated inner weather. It's having a steady enough center that the weather doesn't run the whole show. Make sense? All right. So here's where I get personal, even by my standards. Okay. Past season of Unbound was about my memoir. I was reading it. I was sharing, the things I've lived through and the things I've kept, the things I finally said out loud. And among those things are 2 specific chapters of my life that I spent a long time fighting in my head. One involved a man who used violence to redirect the course of my life. I'll leave the details where they belong. If you listened. If you didn't, go listen. The impact was significant, and the weight of it, the anger and the grief and the complicated mess of feelings that don't always have clean names followed me for a long time. And the other involves a woman I thought was a friend. And I'm being generous by calling her that even now. What I eventually understood was that for her, friendship had a very specific definition. At least in the case of me, it was a vehicle for gossip and for social positioning, for the particular sport of tearing other women down, even people, men and women, so she could feel taller, I guess. And I was one of the ones that was torn down when she was with other friends. I was for a while both a player in that game and eventually a target of it. Okay. Discovering which one you've become is a special kind of reckoning for sure. Like for a long time, my relationship with both of these people, and I use that word loosely, was defined by resistance. It shouldn't have happened. They shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't have trusted her. I shouldn't have been there. I shouldn't. Okay. There's a concept in dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, called radical acceptance. And the name is slightly misleading because it sounds like something soft, something passive, like you're just deciding everything is fine and rolling over and carrying on. It's not that at all. Okay. Radical acceptance is the practice of acknowledging reality as it actually is, without adding a layer of resistance to the pain that's already there. Okay? It's the recognition that pain is inevitable, but suffering, that particular extra layer of anguish that comes from fighting the fact that something happened, is optional. And the difference between the two of them really matters. So you have to understand, pain is this hurt me. Suffering is this hurt me and it shouldn't have, and therefore something is fundamentally broken and I cannot move forward until the universe acknowledges it was wrong. The universe is not going to do that. Okay? I waited. It didn't. Radical acceptance is looking at what actually happened and saying, this is what is. Not this is okay. Not this is fine. Not I forgive you and we're square. Just this happened. This is real. I'm not going to spend another decade in a headlock with a reality that already occurred. What I found on the other side of that acceptance was not indifference. I still know what that man did. I still know who she was. But I stopped leaking energy fighting the fact of them. And that energy went somewhere else, right? Somewhere useful. So I want to talk about forgiveness because that's where I'm heading here. Famously complicated. I want to be really careful here because I think forgiveness gets weaponized, particularly toward women, particularly toward survivors. There's kind of a specific flavor of, have you forgiven them yet? That's less about your healing and more about other people's comfort with your anger, right? I've met that question many times and I don't care for it. So let me tell you what forgiveness actually turned out to be for me, because it was not what I expected. It was not reconciliation. Okay. I don't have a relationship with either of the people I mentioned. I don't need one, don't want one, not the least bit interested. Forgiveness is not the same as reunion. It was not excusing. What they did was what it was, remember? Understanding why someone did something, even arriving at genuine compassion for the wounds that drive people to wound others, does not require you to decide it was acceptable, right? What forgiveness actually was for me was a decision to stop letting them have rent-free space in my nervous system. It was to come back to where we started, a physiological act as much as a psychological one, right? Like carrying active resentment is really hard on your body. It keeps you in your threat response engaged, right? It keeps you in some cellular way still in the room where the harm happened. And no bueno, not good at all. The science on this is pretty clear too. Chronic anger and unforgiveness are associated with elevated cortisol and disrupted sleep, cardiovascular strain, and just a broad range of outcomes that are across the board bad for you, which is deeply unfair, by the way. The person who harmed you is probably fine and sleeping great and continuing on with their nonsense, but here we are. The IFS piece helped me here as well, because I could look at the people who hurt me, not with warm and fuzzy feelings, never, but with a kind of cold and clear understanding. People who harm others are almost always operating from their own unexamined parts, their own exiles running wild, their own nervous system stuck in patterns that they probably never had the language or the support to change. That doesn't excuse them, but it kind of contextualizes them, right? Like they become less mythologically powerful and more just human, sad and human, and not worth another decade of my energy for sure. Forgiving myself was harder, honestly. That took longer. The things I stayed in longer than I should have, and the trust I extended to someone who didn't deserve it. The silences I kept that cost me. I had a lot of retroactive conversations with myself about my own choices, but the IFS framework kind of helped here too. Every choice I made that I later regretted, I made with the tools I had at the time. Every part of me that stayed quiet or stayed put, or extended one more chance. Oh my Lord, did I ever do that a lot with that one particular friend? I knew better. Was trying to protect something, okay? I don't have to approve of those choices to have compassion for the person who made them. And eventually I arrived at something that felt like, if not full absolution, at least a genuine ceasefire with my past self, right? So, we've got a regulated nervous system, okay? A more peaceful inner landscape, acceptance of what happened, radical acceptance, and something that resembles forgiveness, okay? So what do you do with all of that space now? Because one of the things people don't really talk about, about like letting go of resentment and grief is that it leaves this gap, right? You have this gap and you have to fill it with something intentional, or your brain, being the efficient pattern seeking machine that it is, will just find new things to worry about. This is a design flaw I have personally experienced. Not a fan, but what the research says, and I find this genuinely interesting, one of the most powerful antidotes to rumination, to that spinning, grinding loop of self-focused thought that most of us live in to varying degrees, is awe. There's a network in your brain called the default mode network, and it's basically the rumination machine, okay? It's active when you're thinking about yourself, your past, your future, your worries. We should have said in that conversation 6 years ago. And research, including some genuinely compelling work, by a lot of psychologists, shows that when you experience awe, the default mode network quiets down. Your sense of your own problems and your own smallness and your own narrative contracts, like not in a bad way, but in the way that happens when you're, standing in front of the ocean and you remember that you're like one tiny person on one planet in one galaxy among what we are now told are conservatively 2 trillion of them. I don't know. That's what awe does. It puts you in your place kindly. Okay. I've found it in big things, in the Canadian landscape, which is not subtle about its ambitions at all. In concerts where something about the collective experience of music feels like proof of something I can't quite name. Oh man, even in the fact that a seed becomes a tomato, which I continue to find remarkable no matter how many times it happens in my garden. I'm in awe, right? I've also found it in smaller things, like in the way a really good conversation with someone you've known for decades can still surprise you. In the fact that my son exists and has a personality I genuinely enjoy. Maybe in a piece of writing, mine or someone else's, that says exactly the thing you didn't know you needed said. Awe is not reserved for mountaintops and total solar eclipses, though those count too. It's available in the ordinary. And if you train your attention to look for it, you'll find it. And the looking itself, like that deliberate practice of noticing what's extraordinary about regular existence, is a form of healing. It's a way of saying the world is larger than my pain. I'm part of something larger than my story. Not instead of my story. I'm not suggesting you transcend it, float away from it, or achieve some enlightened view from above. Your story matters. Mine does. That's why I write it. But the story doesn't have to be the whole damn sky, right? So that's the architecture as I've lived it. That's what I actually did with the mess. I got my nervous system out of crisis mode, not once, but repeatedly. Still do, because it's a practice, right? It's not a place you go. It's not a destination. I got curious about the internal noise instead of fighting it, and I stopped wrestling with a reality that had already occurred. I did that long and non-linear, occasionally excruciating work of forgiveness, which turned out to be more about my own freedom than anyone else's absolution, right? And I kept looking for awe because the alternative is rumination, and I've spent enough time there to know it's not a great neighborhood. It's a bit of a ghetto in the brain there. Peace. Peace, I've come to believe, is not a place you arrive at and stay. It's something you return to over and over and over again. You get knocked out of it by traffic and bad news and old wounds that get poked around by whatever, unexpectedly. And then you find your way back, right? The path gets more familiar with practice. The distance back gets a lot shorter, I promise. It doesn't mean you're never angry. I still get angry, especially when I'm told to relax. Just kidding about that. Well, not kidding. I'm serious. I do sometimes get angry. Some things deserve anger, right? Like, it doesn't mean you never grieve. Grief is appropriate. It doesn't mean you've forgotten anything. I remember everything. It's actually part of why I write. I don't share everything I write, and I write a lot. It just means that the past, the full complicated weight of my past, your past, anyone's past, doesn't have its hands around the steering wheel of my present life. And that, after the years it took to get here, that's a lot. That's a big deal to me for sure. So there you go. That's what I did with my mess. Thanks for listening. I hope that this has helped you in some way and that you'd be willing to do the work and find a glimmer. I'll talk to you next time.
You've been listening to Unbound Off Script. The script is gone, the chair is empty, and Beth Curry is officially out of here. If you've got something you want her to dive into next time, let us know. Until then, stay curious, stay raw, and keep it unbound. We're out.